Hi there, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times, and I would like to speak to you today about an expression that is very common and in Canadian society, and it is the phrase residential school denialism or residential school denier. And it is my view that this term should be banned in Canada. Now, why do I believe that? Well, there's two reasons. The first and most important of which is that using the term denialism is a form of Holocaust denial that is called by Jewish groups Holocaust trivialization. It is a way to, through false equivalence, compare some unjust cause to the Holocaust to generate sympathy for a cause. And in doing so, sometimes unwittingly, this diminishes the seriousness of the Holocaust. We're at a time right now where we've just witnessed, the world has seen the massacre at Bondi Beach in Australia on Hanukkah. We are in an age of dramatically increased anti-Semitism, and we need to step up, I believe, as a society and condemn anti-Semitic tropes wherever we see them. So that is one reason. The second reason, and I will get into that and explain that further in a moment. The second reason is that I believe the expression or the concept behind denialism makes no sense whatsoever. As Coast Salish Indigenous lawyer and chief Aaron Pete has explained, the term denialism as it applies to residential schools doesn't make any sense because no one's denying anything. Nothing is being denied. So with those 2 points, I'd like to explain a little bit about where I am today and what is behind me and why I'm in this location. I'm on the grounds of Southlands Elementary School in Dunbar in Vancouver, BC. Why am I here? Well, this is where I went to elementary school. And why is it that significant? Because many of my classmates here were from the Musqueam Indian Reserve. I started kindergarten in 1965. In the early 1960s, residential schools for Indians began to be, the education of those children began to be integrated with regular schools. And that was my experience. The Musqueam Indian Reserve is just a fairly short walk from here, perhaps just over a kilometer. And many of my classmates here were Musqueam kids. So for us little kids growing up here, we never thought, oh, well, there was no great sense of discrimination and prejudice and racism that was permeating our school. In fact, it was totally the opposite. The period in question, the mid-1960s, was the height of the civil rights movement. And when I, went through, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and on into, I went up to grade 6 here, the teachers here were very much bringing to the children the spirit of the times. The zeitgeist of the 1960s was this idea of a new age dawning. It's like the Fifth Dimension song, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. This idea that peace and love would permeate the society, and that children should be raised in a different way so that they would grow up and grow out of the prejudices that they perhaps had, their parents had experienced. So it was within this milieu that I grew up, and I very much embraced those those values of inclusion, and to make sure there was a saying that was drilled into our heads: never judge someone based on the way they look. I still remember that as a small child, learning that right here at Southlands Elementary School. But when it comes to the Indigenous kids that went here from the reserve, I would say there was two things that I remember about that, two feelings. One was sadness, and the other was fear. Even a small child can tell when things are not fair. It was evident that the situation for the kids, the Musqueam kids, was not fair. I distinctly remember my teacher in grade 1 announcing before the class that one of the desks was empty because the girl was in hospital with hepatitis. It's the first time I'd ever heard the word hepatitis, and I had to ask my mom what that meant, and she said, so this sense of sadness, and the opposite was a sense of fear, because many of the Musqueam kids were the nicest, gentlest, kindest people, and they were just like everyone else. However, also like the rest of society, some of the Indigenous kids were terrible bullies, and there was a sense of fear. I remember being set upon with my friends, near where I lived, and getting beaten up, and my toy electric boat was smashed to bits, and my friend was thrown headlong into the frog pond. And those two kids that laid a beating on us later died of an overdose, both of them. So we knew there was dysfunction, but we really didn't know why. But this idea that people, so I said all that to say that in today's culture, I would be called a residential school denialist. Now, why would that be the case? And maybe I could just delve into one additional part of my history. Is that when I live in New Westminster, and I literally led a parade in 2017 during the 150th year of Canada's anniversary. And the purpose was to spread the message of truth and reconciliation in our community. I collaborated with our local chief, and I brought on Indigenous artists, and it was to spread this message of reconciliation and acknowledgement of the first people of these lands. And the message in our parade float was a First Nations war canoe replica, and it was seen by millions of people from Portland to Penticton. So imagine my shock that people in my own town, including the mayor of my own city, refer to me as a, quote, residential school denialist. Well, why would he accuse me of that? Well, the reason is that I believe in reconciliation, but I do not believe in decolonization, the decolonial narrative. And that decolonial narrative, I believe, has nothing to do with reconciliation. It is based on a theoretical framework that was effectively manufactured in liberal arts colleges around the world, that it was a university manufactured sort of neo-Marxist theory that the colonial governments of the world had basically used capitalism as a means to commit a genocide against Indigenous people, and that was akin to the Holocaust. And that's where I'm going with this. Why the term residential school denialism is wrong. So I would like to read for you a definition of Holocaust trivialization, and I'll just read it out here. It's from the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. Holocaust trivialization is a tool for some ideologically or politically motivated activists to metaphorically compare phenomena they oppose to the industrial scale destruction of the Jews in World War II by the Germans, Austrians, and their allies. Those who abuse Holocaust comparisons for their ideological purposes wish to exaggerate the evil nature of a phenomenon they condemn. Now, I think we can all condemn the mistreatment of Indigenous people in residential schools, the malnourishment, the rampant disease, the poor construction of the buildings, the abuse of the teachers, the underfunding, and the negative experiences that Indigenous children experience in those schools. We can all condemn that. But it was not in any way, shape, or form comparable to the Holocaust, where the Germans systematically murdered, not neglected, not abused, but murdered 6 million Jews. Let's just use one example of how they were killed. There's an expression called the Einsatzgruppen, and this was brought up by Jewish people after October 7, 2023, where roving gangs of gunmen just shot and murdered Jews at will. The Einsatzgruppen were the German killing squads that would round up Jews in villages, take them out, and often just shoot them with machine guns and pour them into mass graves. Nothing like that happened in Canada to Indigenous people. So, why is it then we have a bill being proposed in the Parliament of Canada, Bill C-254, that seeks to apply the Holocaust denial language almost verbatim to what happened to at residential schools? If you look at the wording, it is the condone. It says promoting anti-Semitism for condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. That is the wording that applies to the Jews, and the same words are used to apply to Indigenous people: condoning, denying, downplaying, or justifying the Indian residential school system. So this is clearly this bill that's proposed, and the use of the words in residential school denialism is seeking to apply Holocaust nomenclature to people who question the concept of genocide, that there was a physical genocide. So it is not Holocaust, or there's no form of denialism to say that what happened to the Jews did not happen to Indigenous people. So at a time where anti-Semitism is growing, I believe the mainstream media, politicians, should immediately cease using this expression, residential school denialism, because it is a form of Holocaust trivialization. Now, I can understand why Jews wouldn't want to come out and say this, but I'm saying it. Why would Jews want to attract unto themselves further criticism and opprobrium and scorn? They obviously, I'm not Jewish, but if I was, I would not want to put myself in a position to be further criticized and judged by society because, well, you're just now pointing the finger at Indigenous people and trying to downplay their suffering. That's not what this is about. It's not about the downplaying of suffering. It's about anti-Semitism. So there's another aspect to this, and that is that, unfortunately, a lot of Indigenous activists in Canada, and large Indigenous groups like the Assembly of First Nations have, I hope, unwittingly participated in anti-Semitic movements and calls to action. And this manifests itself in the parallelism, the fallacy of a parallel comparison between, say, Turtle Island and Palestine. So there is a move to demonize the Jews as evil colonizers committing a genocide against the Palestinians. And similarly, well, why don't we just say that has what happened here in Turtle Island? So you go to a pro-Hamas rally such as the ones that we've covered in Vancouver, and almost invariably they will have an Indigenous person at the microphone expressing solidarity with the land defenders and freedom fighters from Turtle Island to Palestine, where, you know, the land back movement is now being associated with terrorism. This is just blatant anti-Semitism that's happening in the streets of Vancouver and around the world. And I believe it has to stop. So there's a book that I would like to recommend that people read that kind of brings this all into focus. It's called On Settler Colonialism, Ideology, Violence, and Justice by Adam Kirsch of the Wall Street Journal. This book very succinctly draws the parallels between the decolonial, anti-colonial narrative that is playing out in Palestine and being used to demonize Jews and whip up anti-Semitism, and the Indigenous rallying cries. Let's not forget, just this week, a terror plot in California was foiled by law enforcement. And the group that was behind the bomb-making and potential deadly terrorist act was called Turtle Island Liberation Front. Forgive me if I don't have the name exactly right, but it was Turtle Island Liberation. So here we have it. We have the terrorist impulse that is directed against the Jews being directly connected to this sentiment about there being a Holocaust or a genocide, or that it has occurred against Indigenous people. And I speak particularly about the Canadian context. And it just never happened. And it's wrong to make that comparison. So another, it's talking about Holocaust, trivialization. There's other examples that you can just Google it, and there's all kinds of examples of it. One of them is in the environmental movement. People who question climate change narratives are called climate change deniers. So this word denier is being used exactly as described. Those who abuse Holocaust comparisons for their ideological purposes wish to exaggerate the evil nature of a phenomenon they condemn. So if you want to disagree with someone's climate theories, if you want to demonize them and make them appear evil, you invoke the Holocaust comparison. We have to understand and just keep on hammering this idea that, and reality, that 6 million murders in an industrial scale. Here's another way that the Indigenous activist lobby, I believe, is acting in a way that is blatantly anti-Semitic. They're borrowing terms like imagery like incinerators. The Jews were gassed and their bodies disposed of in industrial scale ovens by the hundreds of thousands and millions and millions and millions. So in order to falsely compare the residential school system to the Holocaust, They're saying, oh, well, children were put into incinerators. Well, this is a ridiculous comparison to compare what happened there in Auschwitz. The other word that is often used is the word atrocities, residential school atrocities, because everyone knows that the suffering of the Jews in the Holocaust were atrocities, real atrocities, machine gunning hundreds of people into mass graves. The word mass grave that was used by the Kamloops First Nation was intentionally chosen to invoke an image of the Holocaust. So here's the problem, is that the injustice that may have been done at that time is undermined totally by this false equivalence to the Holocaust. We have to stop doing it. It has to end. So what is going on? And it's not just Indigenous people. It is the media. It is primarily left-leaning politicians. It is school teachers. It is educational institutions. It is everywhere. They're participating in this sick hybrid, evil brew of anti-Semitism and justification of terrorism. We saw this in Vancouver. The group, some of you may know that the new Westminster Times was on scene on October 7th, 2024. And we filmed someone from the microphone with, mask, face was completely hidden, saying, "Death to Canada, death to the United States, and death to Israel," all the while blatantly glorifying the slaughter of Jews on October 7th, 2023. They said, "We are Hamas. We are Hezbollah." They call it the Al-Aqsa flood. They use these euphemisms to promote and glorify. So this is the bizarre situation we're in. Holocaust glorification and Holocaust trivialization are overlapping. This is the problem for Indigenous people using this denialism expression, is they want to be receiving the sympathy that the Jews received, but they're doing so in a way where they're actually committing the sin they're trying to stamp out. They're participating in Holocaust denialism by invoking it. It is a paradox that people who would stand with a microphone and say to an assembled crowd of 5,000 people, a genocide happened here in Canada and we want to stop the similar genocide happening in Israel. Well, the word genocide was coined to express what happened to the Jews. And are there other things that rise to the level of genocide? Absolutely. What happened in Rwanda, and certainly the intentional killing of people because of their religion or their ethnic group on a large scale. So this is part of the trivialization, is that the scale of the Holocaust is not paralleled in history. It is unparalleled. So a little bit more about why this topic interests me and why I'm so adamant about pushing back on anti-Semitism. I went to school here as a kid, and then later in life, I was raised in a secular home. I was not a religious person at all, and then I had a religious conversion experience in 1980. I became a born-again Christian, and I went. I started learning the Bible, and I ended up going to the University of British Columbia and went through their religious studies program. It's not a theology program. It is a study of world religions. And I focused my study on the ancient Near East and the study of religion generally. I studied post-biblical Judaism. I studied theories and approaches to religion. So I became very, very interested in the relationship between Christendom and the Jews. And I did a deep dive on that, and I wrote an article in 2006 that I put on the Westminster Times site that I will include in a reply to this story, to this video that is, that gives you an idea of how deep the anti-Semitic DNA runs in Western society. It should not be compared to Islamophobia, for example. Every time a politician now speaks to the topic of anti-Semitism, they say anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, as if they're equivalent. Those are false equivalents. The Western society did not, the Canadian culture has not unleashed the roving murder gangs to kill anyone. And the phenomenon of Islamophobia, which I believe is actually real. People do have an irrational fear of Muslim people, stemming, I believe, from a profound misunderstanding of religion as a whole, and particularly Islam, which I studied, and I actually know a lot about more than just my own religion. I know the history of Islam. But what is described and sort of folded into Islamophobia now becomes any kind of criticism of Islam is saying, oh, it's Islamophobia. And then they say, incidences of Islamophobia as being comparable to anti-Semitism. They're not comparable. What happened to the Jews is a unique evil, and we need to remember that. And we need to push back much more strongly on this than ever before. So, I realize that this idea of banning the expression residential school denialism is going to be a bit of a stretch for many people. But I would like you to do something about it. Write a letter to your public official. Write a letter to the editor. You're watching this on the X platform. Express your opinion. It's good to do that. Talk about it on other social media platforms. If you hear people using the expression, say, aren't you trivializing the Holocaust by comparing? So finally, I'll end up with this. I've spoken in other videos about the Kamloops graves and the concern that the GPR results that indicated, allegedly indicated unmarked graves, has not been ground truth. And this is really evidence of a cover-up. And this has been corroborated just this week by Blacklock's reporter who issued a study about, well, suddenly we're learning that the federal government has sealed documents relating to the investigation of these anomalies. Well, we should be gravely concerned about that. And that particularly right now, there's a lot of concern about people like Dallas Brody, Jim McMurtry, and others who are questioning they're not questioning the existence of residential schools or the facts of history. That's what Holocaust denialism is all about. It's about questioning and sowing doubt into the fact that 6 million Jews were murdered. None of that is going on. Because what is being said is, well, if there's an allegation of murder, there's no proof of a mass killing of Indigenous people, and that allegation is rife, and the mass grave allegation is out there. So that's why this is very important, because it ties into DRIPA, UNDRIP, land claims, court decisions, And the entire economy of BC is all wrapped up in these ideas. So I appreciate you listening, and I'm going to add some links to this, to replies to this tweet, to another article about that I wrote about Indigenous anti-Semitism. It's a thing, and you'll see why when you read this article. But in the meantime, the light is fading, and I appreciate you listening to me today from this soccer field, where I actually learned to play soccer. I was 5 years old, playing soccer behind me for Cop the Shoe Man, and I was later recruited to play for Dunbar Stongs, which ended up being one of the winningest youth soccer teams in the history of Canada. And it was a wonderful experience growing up here in the Dunbar neighborhood, and I have fond memories of growing up. You know, being around Indigenous people is not something new to me. I grew up with like that, and hailing from the mining industry, I've had many opportunities to work alongside Indigenous people in the mining industry, engaging them, spending time with chief and council out on the land. Why are people calling me this horrible slur that I'm tantamount to a Nazi? And that's really the other problem here, is that people are being smeared in the worst possible ways, including me, by my own people who are elected in my own town. That somehow what's happening here is there's no, this is resulting in real serious harm to many people who are being, just the general public in Canada is being smeared as these horrible monsters that are akin to Hitler. So the Hitler, Nazi, this is all a way of trivializing the Holocaust. We got to stop doing it. We got to stop saying that, this group that are questioning the grave narrative of unmarked graves are akin to Nazis. Anyone who says that is trivializing the Holocaust and engaging in anti-Semitic behavior, and it has to stop. So, with that, I thank you for listening. My name is David Brett, the editor of the New Westminster Times.